Strategy groupings is heavily focused upon as one of the best practices. Hi everyone, welcome back. Tina here. Today I am tackling the topic of guided reading groupings versus strategy groupings. This is a topic that came to my attention when I was at the Michigan ELA conference last June, or this past June. I've been doing strategy groupings in my reading for several years now. And sometimes when you do something for several years, you kind of forget that maybe not everyone is familiar with this type of teaching strategy. But it kind of came about from the Daily 5 and now also in the MESA units that my school district is adopting with the Reader's Workshop. Strategy groupings is heavily focused upon as one of the best practices. But many of the teachers I was with at that conference from other school districts were asking question upon question upon question about what is a strategy group and how do you make those work. So right now I'm going to talk about what is guided reading, what is a strategy group, and kind of focus on some of the differences between them and show you how you can make both groups work in your classroom. So for guided reading, you would usually have a group of, say, 5 kids sitting at your little horseshoe or kidney bean table, and you would start your guided reading group off by rereading the book from yesterday. And if today's Monday, you're going to run a running record on one of the children while they're doing the reread. Then tomorrow, Tuesday, you would test the next kid with a running record. Wednesday, you would do the third kid with a running record. And by the end of the week, during that rereading time, you've tested all 5 kids in that group. So you have a running record on all 5. That's usually how they start. Then you would introduce the book that you're going to focus on for that day's lesson. Now, why did you pick this book? Maybe because you're focusing on a phoneme inside the book that you want to cover. Maybe you have a different reason for focusing on it. Maybe it has vocabulary words that you're trying to get really into the minds of those kids. For whatever reason, you have selected the book for that day's guided reading lesson. The first thing you're going to do with a guided reading lesson is you're going to do a book walk or a picture walk. Means the same thing. And you would go through and you're going to talk about what you see in the picture. Oh, I see a pretty little fox right here. I can tell it's a girl fox because there's a bow in her hair. And look, she has lots of friends. And what time of the year is it? It's fall. How do you know? Well, because all the leaves are yellow and orange and red and brown. Okay, and you're going to focus on that word leaves as you go through the book. Why are you saying the word leaves several times? Because it's probably a vocabulary word that the children will not know in print. They know what leaves are, but they are not necessarily, if they're like kindergartners or first graders, they're not going to recognize this word in print. So hopefully by the time you finish the book walk, when they sit down to then read that book themselves, that word leaves is just going to flow right out of their mouth, all right? After you do, the children read the book independently, and while they're reading it independently, you're kind of listening in on each one, going around the table, and then once everybody's done, you would collect the books back or maybe have a quick little book talk, no more than a minute or so. And a lot of time in a guided reading lesson, at that point you might spend anywhere from about 5 minutes doing a phonics lesson, or maybe you're going to find something in the book. You know, look, boys and girls, this word pile, P-I-L-E, pile. That I says its name. What did I teach you just the other day that tells me why this I says its name? Well, there's a magic E there. Okay, so you're going to hit on a skill that you've already covered. And then you're done with that group. You would call your next group and send those children on their way to whatever activities you have planned. So that is a very typical guided reading scenario. Now, with strategy groupings, or let me go back real quick. With a guided reading, usually you can write out your entire week's worth of guided reading lesson plans in advance. You know which kids are in which groups because you've already leveled them. and you know what skills you're going to hit and focus on. So yes, you can do lesson planning in advance. Strategy groups are very different. Strategy groups, the children are not all reading the same book. I mean, and that right there at the conference I just attended was kind of blowing the mind of a lot of the people in that room with me. Like, well, how do you teach a group if they're not all reading the same book? You know, how do you teach a group if you have one child who's a DRA 6 and one child who's a DRA 12 and one child who's a DRA 20? I'm pulling those 3 kids for a strategy group. So there was a lot of confusion. But I swear I've been doing this for years. It's actually very easy. I will say with strategy groups, I do not write my lesson plans in advance for knowing which groups I'm going to be pulling at what day of the week. Honestly, strategy groups come about as I'm doing individual conferences. So I might spend that first week of school or first 2 weeks of school meeting with every kid in the room for just 2 or 3 minutes and having a one-on-one reading with them. And I'm going to learn something they're good at, something they're weak at, something that we really need to target and set as their own personal goal. All right. And then once I realize that, wow, I have these 4 children who all really need to use the exact same strategy, in my binder that is my reading pensive or my anecdotal records, if you will, I have a calendar. And I also have like a keeping track form. I'm gonna start writing down names, and right next to those names, I'm gonna write down the reason I need to see those 4 kids. So strategy groupings really do kind of happen on the fly. As you see a problem that needs to be addressed, you make a note of it, and then at the first chance possible, you address it. Some of your lower readers, you're going to pull more frequently for strategy groups to try to bump them up. Those kids in your room who are just amazing readers, like just blow your mind good reading, you may not meet with them in a group nearly as much as you do with your lower groups. All right. So let's say the strategy I really want to focus on is expressing emotions, really showing those emotions when you're reading. Like read it the way someone would actually say it if it was happening in real life. So I have this little book, Wake Up Rooster. I'm going to pull my kids to me, and now this will be a strategy I've previously taught as a whole class focus lesson. And a focus lesson is like 10 minutes where you teach the strategy to the whole class. You model it to them, ask one kid to model it back to you, and then you send them on their way to start into their authentic read the self. But so now I have my 4 little darlings and I want to focus on reading with expression. Say it the way the person would say it in real life. So I come through here and I have this picture. And I'm going to ask the children real quick, look at this picture. All right? I know it says, wake up, horse. The horse does not wake up. And I'm going to say to the kids, what are these? And what do they do? And they may not know that they're called symbols, but they're going to know that you bang them together like pots and pans, and it makes a loud noise. All right? And I'm going to say, do you think this person, do you think the farmer would say this? Wake up, horse. And the kids are like, no, no, no. How do you think he's going to say it? And then those kids are like, wake up, horse. You know, which is what you kind of want them to do. You want them to say those words with the expression the character in the book would say them with. That's when I'm going to put this book down and I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to listen to you guys read me a page or 2 from your book. And when it's your turn, I want you to read it out loud to me, and I want you to use that kind of expression. We're going to look at the picture, we're going to see what kind of emotion your character is showing, and then you're going to say those words with the right voice, right? And I would listen to child number 1, go through the motions, and a lot of times if you've done writer's workshop meetings, you know that usually child number 2 is eavesdropping on child number 1. That's a good thing. But what are the other 3 doing while I work with child number 1? They're independently reading right there at the table. but they're just waiting for their turn, and while they're waiting, they are reading. They're not sitting there twiddling their thumbs. And usually the child next to them is eavesdropping. I'll reteach the lesson with child number 1. That might take a minute, 2 minutes. Then I move on to child number 2. They read me a passage from their book. I repeat the process. Again, child 1 and child 3 are now eavesdropping on child 2's independent time with me. Move on to child 3. Move on to child 4. Once I've gotten through all 4 children, I remind them what the strategy is one last time, and then I send them off to do their reading activities, whether they are reading to themselves or reading to a partner or listening to reading. And that is a strategy group. A strategy group can be done with 2 kids. A strategy group can be done with 5 kids. It's whenever you see more than one child needing to have the same strategy taught. So that's the big difference between the 2 kinds of groups. The pros of a guided reading group probably are that you can plan for it. You can pick out what books you want to read each day of the week with those groups, and you can figure out whatever lessons you're going to teach from those little books that day. One of the pros of a guided reading group is the fact that the kids are all reading the same book to you. And so I know for some teachers that might bring a certain comfort level. There's familiarity with it. What are the pros for strategy groups? The pros for strategy groups are I can pull a group at a moment's notice. I really can. And then let's say I don't have a group today. Let's say it's Wednesday and I realize there are no children written in my calendar to have an appointment that day for a group. Okay, not a problem. I'm now going to start having one-on-one individual conferences. I like to have about 5 to 6 individual conferences a day. I like to, by the end of the week, have seen the entire class at least one time, one-on-one with my students. You cannot do that if you're doing all guided reading groups, because guided reading groups are pretty rigid, and just by design they require a set number of minutes, and usually by the time you finish a guided reading group you don't have time then for individual conferences. Whereas, a guided reading group might take 20 minutes. I can do a strategy group in 10, depending on the number of kids in that group. I also find for myself, I prefer strategy groups, because the whole premise of guided reading was that the grouping of students was supposed to be fluid and children would move up and down between the groups as they progressed as readers. I don't find that happening. I find with guided reading, the kids tend to stay in that group all year long. Yes, 2 or 3 might bust out of a group and suddenly progress real fast and jump a group, but traditionally, in my experience, they kind of get locked into that group, so that whole group moves up together or stays back together. With strategy groups, the levels don't matter anymore. I mean, it's a non-issue, and I find it kind of frees the kid to tackle harder books and not be held back by the others. So that is the big difference between strategy groups and guided reading groups. If you have more questions, please ask them in the comment box below. If there was something here that I failed to cover, or you still are like, okay, I think I get it, but I'm not sure I get it. Again, ask the questions, and if I need to make another video on this topic, I will happily do so. With that though, I am going to wrap up this video. Leave me a thumbs up if you thought it was helpful. When you put a thumbs up on the video, it shares with a broader audience, and maybe more new teachers can see this one. And if you want to see more from the future, click that subscribe button, and I will talk to you guys later.